inclusive history of Western North America. Her research interests include the relationship between material culture, ethnicity, and gender, cultural landscapes, and the politics of heritage management. Dr. Clark serves as the curator of archaeology for the University of Denver Museum of Anthropology. She's a research consultant for the Colorado History Museum and serves on the Colorado and National Register of Historic Places Review Board. She is the author of the forthcoming book, On the Edge of Purgatory, which she's going to tell us a bit about this evening, an archaeology of place in Hispanic Colorado. And I'm going to go ahead and let you know who's coming up next. Come on over and start getting started here. So Dr. Clark is going to speak with us first, and then we'll hear from Hava Gordon from the Department of Sociology and Criminology. Dr. Gordon's research has explored how multiple social inequalities together shape youth political movements, and that's the subject of her recent book, We Fight to Win: Inequality and the Politics of Youth Activism, as well as multiple journal articles, and her current research focuses on community struggles over urban school reform. So we'll be hearing from each of our speakers who will tell us a bit about their research and writing strategies, and then we'll open the floor to a more conversational dynamic where we'll ask questions, interact with one another, and hopefully learn quite a bit about their research methods in publishing. So without further ado, oh, and also I should just make a note that Dr. Philippot unfortunately was not able to join us this evening, so that'll give us a little bit more time with Bonnie and Hava before we go on. So.
Don't tell me. Well, hi everybody. Thank you for coming out on a beautiful Tuesday night, although it's starting to get a little chilly out there. There's a lot of public perception about what it is that archaeologists are and what they do. So I had to kind of put up Indiana Jones up on the screen here. And you may have noticed that he never took any field notes. You ever notice that? He never had a pencil in his hand. And something I'm going to hope to convey to you today is that these kinds of tools, that are digging tools, are really important, but that these kinds of tools, our field journals and our pencils, are just as important. And really, in fact, it's what distinguishes us from looters. Because people who are just out there to get the goodies, like Dr. Jones there, they're not carefully documenting everything they find. And that is really the importance of archaeology, is that if we are trying to understand people's behavior in the past through the things they leave behind, which is what we're doing, we have to very carefully document everything we find and its relationship to each other. And this is particularly true when we're doing excavations, because as we dig a site, we only get to do it once. And so that very careful, systematic record keeping of what we find is critical to our fieldwork. But in fact, there are a number of different places and times when we write. And in fact, I would say that writing is sort of infused through the whole process of what we do as archaeologists, and I think that's very true of any researcher, particularly in the social sciences. But so the first thing is that prior to research, before we even get in the field, we have to write a research design. And there's a lot of different reasons for that I'm not going to go into, but we write research designs as well as grants. And then while we're in the field, while we're doing research, we're constantly taking notes. Then while we're doing analysis, we're also kind of formulating what we're doing, and that's when we start giving conference papers and conference presentations as part of our ongoing work of trying to figure out what we're seeing. And then after our research, then we publish in a bunch of different ways. And I'm going to talk about three key genres: the peer-reviewed journal article, the book chapter in an edited volume, as well as the single-authored monograph about a particular site or a particular research project. And as an example, what I'm going to use is the La Placita project, which was work that I started back in 1999. And this fall, in 2011, the book is going to come out. So think about that. It's an 11-year arc of a research project. Yeah, and you know, I would like to say that that's not typical, but I think it's actually relatively typical. And one of the reasons why, if you're interested in research, you should be going to conferences, because that's where stuff comes out quickly, as opposed to in these kinds of publications. But so you can kind of see the timeline there, where it begins with writing research designs, and then going and doing field work. Then there's several years of analysis, which includes work in the lab, which I'm not going to talk about too much, but certainly we're taking notes as we're doing that. Conference papers, then a peer-reviewed journal article, and followed by book chapters, and then finally a monograph. Research design. What does it contain? These are a kind of, I'm laying this out for you with La Placita. Those are the kind of details of the research design for the work that I did. But of course, I think the major topics, though, are pretty common to any sort of a research project. First thing, you need to situate it within the field. So basically, you need to prove to somebody that you can actually do this work because you've read enough, you know enough to be able to go out there and do it. So you're familiar with the discipline and where your research is going to fit into it, how it kind of comes out of the field. And you can see there for the work that I was doing, it was a kind of, because it's interdisciplinary, it's historical archaeology, it involves both archaeological research as well as history. And then some of my specific theoretical issues, interests in identity and gender and place. And then in the research design, you lay out your basic research topics. Okay, what are the things that I'm going to be looking at? Now, sometimes it's going to be a research question. You're going to actually put it as a question. Sometimes it might be a hypothesis that you're going to test. Sometimes it's just going to be a sort of suite of things of these are the things I'm kind of interested in. All of those are, depending on the field, a kind of legitimate way to go about doing a research design. And then your research design is going to identify your methods for gathering data to help you discuss those topics or help you answer those questions or test those hypotheses. So in my case, it involved a sort of systematic site survey looking at everything that was on the surface of the site, as well as doing excavations both within household structures and outside, because I was interested in the use of space, and then archival research, because it is, again, a time period when there are some historic records, although there were actually no records about this site in particular. And then it discusses some kind of broader impact of the work. This is the why should anyone care? Why should you fund my research? Why should you give me the okay to go ahead and dig on your property? And a research design does a number of important things. It gives you approval. So particularly for the work that I do, there are legal issues involved, and I often have to get a legal permit to do the work that I'm doing. I also, of course, need and sometimes that is because I'm working on federal land, but sometimes I just need approval from the landowner. I also need to do funding. You know, research is expensive, and the research design is one of the main ways that you get funding. It's a really important part of any budget, grant writing. And then it creates this blueprint for your research and analysis. Now, of course, what you think you're going to find out and then what you actually find out are often very different things, but at least you get going on the right track. So I wrote my research design, and then I went out in the field for 2 years. And so here's an example of the different types of writing that we do when we're in the field. So on the left-hand side is my field journal. So here's an example. I always have one. If you ever take an archaeology class from me where we go in the field, you will have one of these too. And it goes with you everywhere, and it's a sort of narrative, a kind of day-by-day story of what you're doing. And you'll notice in both of these documents that facial information is really important because where we're working and where we're finding things is critical for this kind of 3D understanding of the ways that sites are built and that we're uncovering them. So I get a mixture, but I kind of have a narrative flow. And then as the site director, I have that. And then, of course, everyone who's working on the project has those as well. And I file those away and use those when I'm doing my analysis. So this is like the first draft, if you will. Then there's also a field form, which is a very specific, this is an example of what you would fill out for an excavation unit. But we also have them for survey. And so this is very data heavy. But again, there is places in there for interpretation. Even deciding what you're going to write down there, what you leave out, is already that step towards interpretation. I'm not going to talk, like I said, I'm not going to talk too much about the lab, but that's another place where, as we're analyzing artifacts, we're writing about them, we're putting them into databases. But then, as the project gets closer towards the end, you've done enough analysis that you feel confident to start talking about it in public, then you start going to conferences. and you start giving papers at conferences. And conferences papers, at least in my field, are really important as a step towards getting things published. And in particular, there are lots of edited volumes that begin as a symposium at a conference. So I put up for you an example of a conference paper for a symposium that I co-sponsored with the woman who ended up being my co-editor for the volume. So in 2003, we put together this session, and then 5 years later, it came out as a book. And partly the reason why that took so long is that edited volumes are difficult. You know, you get lots of articles from other people, you're trying to pull them together, and so they do take some time, but they are a really an important publishing venue in my field for research. But one of the things I wanted to show you with this is how similar, in this particular instance, something that I wrote for a conference paper ended up being to the actual publication. And so again, you can think of these as like the conference paper is then a draft of the book chapter. Another very important publication venue is peer-reviewed journal articles, where you will send them into a journal, other people will look at them, they will get back to you, and then you publish them. And I did have a peer-reviewed journal article for this work as well. I did bother to put an excerpt up there for you. And then, while I was doing this and kind of parceling out little bits and parts into book chapters, then I was working on a book-length monograph about my research. And this is an excerpt from the manuscript, and something that I talked with Jennifer about that she wanted me to kind of bring up to you is the issue of voice in writing, and particularly in academic writing and writing about research. And that there was a time when social scientists didn't necessarily use the first person very, very often as a kind of way to make things seem more objective. But really, in fact, there's always a researcher behind it. There's always an author. There's always someone who's doing that interpretation. And so I'm pretty committed to making that clear that there were options, and these were options that I chose. As well as, and I think this is particularly in terms of making writing a little bit more vivid, particularly in a field science, we oftentimes talk about that field experience. You know, I went to the field and I saw this and I felt this, and it makes it feel more like a story, a little bit more of a narrative. But this is something that still is maybe a little bit of an issue in various fields of the social sciences, because this is my thing. You think grading is painful? Try anonymous peer reviews of your book. Think about how long I've worked on this, and I get my review back, and the first one says, this reader found himself engaged. Happy, good, and the second reader hated it. He hated my use of the first person in particular. Well, something that I found out, kind of reading against the lines, is that the first reviewer was a prehistoric archaeologist, and archaeologists as anthropologists have really kind of embraced, again, the first person and the understanding that the researcher plays a role. But the second reviewer was a historian, and historians tend to use the first person a lot less. Is there anybody here who's a history major? No one will admit it?
Good.
Anyway, just beware. So, and this is interesting because as an interdisciplinary field, I kind of got caught here because this historian really did not like the way that I was writing. And my prehistoric colleague was fine with it. So they ended up sending it a third time out to a historical archaeologist who again reiterated that the way that I was using the first person was fine. But just to kind of end to say that persistence pays off. So after 11 years, this is I just got this email about 2 weeks ago. That's the cover of my book, and yay! So it's gonna happen. But there's also the edited volume, which was also really important, and all of these different ways of writing through the process. It's going to finally come out on the bookshelf, and I'm still not entirely tired of the story, so that's good. But that's, I'm going to end with that and pass it over, and I will shut this down so you guys don't have to stare at my...
Okay, yeah, we can go ahead and just turn it, because you don't need to do that.
Right.
So I'll just go ahead and turn that off. Thank you very much, Bonnie.
And now we will hear from Hava Gordon, who, as some of you have entered late, is going to tell us a little bit about her research and writing in sociology and criminology. And we're still getting
Well, thanks for having me. So I'm in sociology. I teach courses on youth cultures and social movements and schooling and inequalities and qualitative research methods. And my main work, my most recent work, is work on youth political activism. So I just had a book come out in 2009 called We Fight to Win: Inequality in the Politics of Youth Activism. And as Bonnie was saying, there is a long stretch of time between actually doing the research and when it comes out. So the book that came out in 2009 was based on research I did between 2002 and 2004, kind of right at the beginning of the war in Iraq going on. And so I'm going to talk a bit about why, the process of turning research into writing and how come there was such a long lag time there. First, I got interested in studying youth activism was kind of by an accident. I went to grad school thinking I was going to study sex education politics, and I had been a sexual health educator. I was one of those people in high schools who would, put the banana on the condom, kind of show everyone what to do, and I realized that in different schools we had different rules on what we could talk about and what we couldn't. And so I started to wonder why it was that the politics of silences existed around youth, and why we were protecting youth and kind of protecting youth innocence. And that got me thinking a little bit on ageism and what young people deserve to hear and what they're kind of banned from hearing, this kind of frank conversation. So that's why I went to grad school, thinking I was going to study this. And this project on youth activism actually came out of a class on ethnography. So I was taking this class on ethnography, and before even the first day of class, the professor emailed all of us and said, before you even come to the first day, I want you to pick a site. Just pick a site, not even a research question, but a site. Tell me where you're going to immerse yourself in for the rest of the quarter. And so at the time, I was living in Portland, Oregon. And if you're familiar with the Pacific Northwest, anyone from there? A little bit? Okay, a few. So for those of you who know about Portland, you know that Portland is this really rich site of urban anarchist counterculture. A lot of anarchism comes out of Portland and Seattle, that kind of thing. So at the time I was living in Portland, and there was this anarchist collective downtown. I had always wanted to walk in, but I never quite had the courage to do it. And I didn't consider myself an anarchist because I was really curious. So I thought, this is going to be my site. I don't know what my research question is, but this is going to be where I'm going to immerse myself for the next 10 weeks. And it turned out to be such a lucky, fortunate thing, because when I walked in, I saw there was all kinds of groups meeting. There were animal liberation activists and environmental activists, and there was a group called KIDS, which was a youth liberation group. And they were there to talk about ageism. And I thought, bingo, this is what I've been actually trying to get at, but I couldn't find in sociology. I couldn't find a lot of literature on ageism as a real inequality. And instead of looking at how sex education reflects it, I want to understand how young people themselves talk about it. So with their permission, I started to sit in on their meetings, and these were a group of radical kids who were on the verge of dropping out of high school. And they kind of renamed it Dropping Up. They were kind of saying it's not necessarily a terrible thing, we're dropping up, we're kind of recreating the schooling system for ourselves. And so they set up this free school at this collective, and they taught their own classes to each other. And they had classes on lockpicking and breakdancing and urban gardening and all kinds of stuff. So they let me sit in on these classes. They had curfew protests downtown. I went to some of the curfew protests. And this was right about the time when they started joining the anti-war protests also that were brewing in not just Portland, but San Francisco, New York, all over the place. So I decided this was going to be my dissertation research. It opened up a whole world of teenage political activism. And what got me really interested was understanding how teenage activists claim political power in a society that usually sees teenagers as non-political beings. So we usually think of teenagers as kind of citizens in the making. We're training them to kind of inherit our democracy and be responsible voters, but we don't really talk about how they claim political power as kids. So that's what I wanted to start to look at. So that became the beginning of my research. And then I realized I knew enough that whatever I was looking at in Portland was going to be specific to these Portland youth, and also mostly these white middle-class youth. And so I knew I had to build in some kind of a comparison. because I wanted to know how they grappled with ageism and how that might be different across class and race contexts. So I decided to create kind of a comparative research strategy. And I was going to do ethnography in Portland and also in Oakland. And I found a group in Oakland, a group of low-income Black and Latino youth who were willing to let me sit in on their meetings, their retreats, their protests, as long as I shared the research with them. And they said that a lot of people had come in to research them and had walked away with the data and never shared their research. And so they asked me, as long as you share your research with us at the end, we'll let you sit in as long as you want. So they really made me a part of their movement. So for 2 years, I was kind of going back and forth between Portland and Oakland. I went to protests. I went to protests at City Hall. I went to protests at school board. I attended intense retreats, intense weekends, summer programs, rallies. I rode with youth around the city on buses. And so what I had is this massive amount of experience with these youth and little snippets of conversation. And the important part was to write field notes. Just like Bonnie was mentioning, carrying around a notebook all the time to write my field notes and record everything that's going on. And ethnography can be tricky because depending on who you are and what the setting is, you might be able to write and write and write without anyone thinking you're strange. You also might not be able to write. So I know some of you might be doing ethnography in a cafe, is that right?
Ooh, yeah.
Yes, okay. So you know, in a cafe, if you're doing participant observations, you could get away with writing your field notes, talking about everything you see, everything you smell, conversations you hear, and no one will think you're strange, although you might feel creepy, because you know you're writing about other people and they don't know you're writing about them. But, for example, if you're at a punk show, if you're at a protest, you take out a piece of paper and start writing, you're going to be really, really conspicuous. So I decided to kind of create a ritual for myself, that after every visit to the field, I sat down and I wrote and wrote and wrote afterwards, at a cafe or with a cup of coffee or tea, and the point was to get everything down before I forgot it. And in some ways, ethnography is the most inefficient kind of research. You write down everything. It's kind of a catch-all, because you never know what's going to be important and what you're going to throw away later. So I wrote and wrote and wrote everything I heard, everything that people said to me, everything I noticed, things that struck me as strange, even the uncomfortable feelings I had, and I had a lot of uncomfortable feelings. So over 2 years, I was wishing that I had chosen a different project. Quite often, because I felt like the creepy adult on both sides. And in Oakland, I felt like an outsider even more because I was the only white person there. So I had a lot of kind of feelings of being kind of strange in my notes, but I put that all there because you also never know if your own emotional reactions might kind of be an insight to something important going on in the field. So I did this, I took meticulous field notes over 2 years, and I also triangulated this with in-depth interviews. Have any of you talked about triangulation in research? A little bit? Okay, so this is basically...
We will.
Okay,
That's week 5.
Okay, if you haven't, you will. So this is basically important because in ethnography, when you're writing about what people do, you have access to what they're doing and how they're doing things, but you don't know why they're doing things. And so you always want to use another method to kind of give you another lens on what you're seeing, and to compare those two methods to make sure they resonate with each other. So I decided to also conduct 40 in-depth interviews, and I sat down with 20 youth activists in Portland and 20 youth activists in Oakland. Some of these interviews were 45 minutes, some of them lasted 3 hours. And I asked them questions about things I was seeing in the field, asked them questions about their beliefs and motivations and their struggles with their activism, and what they perceived as their victories. And it was very important that I audio recorded these. And the point of in-depth interviewing also is to get people's exact words. You want to get exactly how they see things, the language that they use, not to paraphrase it in your own words. So, to analyze my data, I had a mess of field notes, journals full of field notes, just all kinds of random experiences and observations. And I had hundreds of pages of transcribed interviews. And the beauty of qualitative research is that you don't have to wait until you've collected all your data to start analyzing it. you can actually start analyzing it while you're in the field and while you're taking notes, while you're doing interviews. So I took a subset of my notes and also a subset of my interviews, and I started to write down in the margins ideas or summaries of what I was reading. So if I was talking about kids kind of showing up to a meeting and showing off their bruises from the May Day march in Portland, having kind of gotten beaten by police with batons, then I would write police brutality. How does police brutality figure into their worlds? If they were talking about gender struggles, I would write gender in the margins. I had a collection of all of these tiny notes in the margins. And it's okay if they were random. I didn't care if they didn't cohere into a cohesive story. The point was to write them down. After a while, I started to look at those and started to group them under umbrellas, big umbrellas. So the first step in coding data is called open coding, where you're just writing the little notes in the margins. The second is more focused coding, and that's kind of figuring out what are the overarching themes that many of these little notes fit under. After I got those, I got maybe 7 or 8 overarching themes. And I went back to my notes, and I'm very old school about this. I actually assigned a highlighter color to each of those overarching themes. And I went back through my notes and highlighted passages in the corresponding color. So when I talked about young people's interactions with police, or with principals, or with adults that they really clash with, for some reason I saw that as red, and I had red all over my interview transcripts and all over my field notes. When they talked about allies, adult allies in the community, other activists, I took green. I put that in green. And those actually became the chapters later on of my book, all of those bigger themes. There is software that can help you kind of put all these together, but I didn't use software. I actually cut out those red kind of passages, those green passages, and I storyboarded them out on my living room floor. And I tried to figure out how the interview quotes and the instances and examples from field notes would flow together. And those became kind of my miniature stories. Those each became part of my book, each chapter. As Bonnie was saying, you know, the first thing you do before you even write something up formally is to test it out at a conference. And so a lot of those chapters I write up as a more informal conference papers to get feedback. And then I would get some feedback and turn those into journal articles. And after getting some feedback from that, I turned the journal articles, I revised those into more engaging book chapters. So then I had a draft of a book, and that goes out to blind reviewers as a peer review process. So while you're writing that, reviewers look at the entire book, they go through chapter by chapter to kind of tell you this is what's good, this is what needs to be rethought, rewritten, reconceptualized, and then you have to go back to the drawing board, revise it, try again, another draft, goes out for another round of peer review, and then you go back and rewrite, and finally it comes out. So that's part of why there's such a lag time between that initial experience of actually being in the field and having a finished product. And I'll talk more about that, but that's about it.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Thank you. I think it might be easier if we just stand sort of, we could perch at the stage end here and, okay, so I would like to thank again Bonnie and Hava for coming to share their research and writing strategies with us. And now we have time for you to ask questions of them, either about their specific research projects, about research and writing in their disciplines, or sort of the larger categories of the social sciences, for example, or what advice they might have for you about particular research projects you think you might face this term. So who has a question?
I had a very tiny specific question.
Oh, okay.
Bonnie, you showed a slide with your spatial field notes, and I think what was called a field form or something. Is that a disciplinary genre, or did you invent that? I mean, is that
Oh,
something
no,
you
I did not invent it. It's a disciplinary genre. There's various different versions of it.
Okay.
And there's some that are specific for different types of tasks. So you have these kind of set forms, but it's particularly because so much of my research on a day-to-day basis is not done by me. I mean, when I'm in the field, I have crews of 10 people often, and so to get consistency in the data that they're gathering, we use these forms,
okay.
and so I tweak them they very much are a disciplinary genre, and you know, if you ask somebody where their field forms came from, they can tell you, like, well, I borrowed them from the field school I went to when I was in school, and then I changed it, so.
Other questions? Yes.
You said that as an archaeologist you found that there was this sort of conflicting, like first person versus third person, because it was cross-disciplinary sociology and history kind of. So I was wondering if you found that there was more first person because you're studying sociology, or what sort of voice authors in your field wrote?
Right. Well, ethnographers write a lot in first person, and there's a recognition that that you have to put out your own lens first before the reader can trust what you're saying. So as a white middle-class woman, me going into Oakland and being the only white girl and not living in Oakland meant that I didn't have the same access to their activist worlds that another person living in Oakland in their communities would have had. And it doesn't mean the story that I told is wrong, but it is limited, and I had to talk about that. And I had to talk about the different moments where I felt that distance. So, for example, I actually open a chapter of one of my most embarrassing moments in the field, which was in Oakland at a retreat, and the youth activists were doing this icebreaker, and they divided up into teams, and the team had to guess which dance their representative was doing, and the other team picked the representative to do a dance. So the point was to pick someone who didn't know how to do the dance. And so they picked me to do the first dance, and I had to draw the dance out of a hat. And it said, "Go stupid." Does anyone know how to go stupid? Does anyone know how to do this or what that means? Because I wasn't sure if this was a generational thing or if it was a race thing or an Oakland thing or what. But I had to stand there, and they counted down from 10 to 0. And I had to go stupid, hoping that my team would guess what I was doing. And I did it, but it made me realize the distance between myself and them in that moment. And I put that out there in the book. So I think ethnographers always put themselves in their work, and they'll have a very thorough appendix, at least, or even a chapter, devoted to exactly how they got in and how far they got access into those communities, so that the reader can judge.
Other questions? This is the quietest faculty panel group we've ever had. Anybody? Yeah, question.
Bonnie, I was wondering, one of my classes, we went through some of the field notes that are posted online, like translating them, which is a great, interesting task. And I noticed that there was the first person that appears in those field notes. Like, at what point in the process do you think that I starts to get?
You know, it depends a lot on the person, and partly it's also that there's this whole series of eyes. So, you know, I've got those field notes, and they're taken again by 15, 20 people, as well as in my own set. And so then I'm kind of balancing the interpretations that other people are making, and also, again, very much that triangulation, because they're making that first cut of interpretation in the field, but then I'm going back and looking a little bit further at the artifacts, or maybe I'm getting different data from a specialist who's looking at soils, and it helps me understand the site in a different way. So, so where the I comes in from my writing is where it's very much my decision of, I've got all of this data, and this is where I'm going, but I want to acknowledge the fact that it could have been otherwise. So that's an important, and I've actually done a little bit of analysis, because I was actually I was really taken aback by those reviews, because in general, and again, ethnographers, anthropologists have very much kind of embraced that. There's whole books about ethnographic writing, and even a book on writing and archaeology. And so I was really surprised by that, and it helped me understand that this was coming from history. So I started to look at Hayden White, who's written about narrative and history, and about how his story, and it's interesting, again, it's partly about how much your discipline feels like you need to foreground you as that kind of a person with a past and with an agenda and with a certain level of access that has a lot to do with who you are. Sort of the more kind of natural science you get, the more that kind of disappears. And so because anthropology is because archaeology in particular is very multidisciplinary, we kind of, we borrow from lots of those things. So I certainly have students who feel very uncomfortable kind of owning their own interpretations in that way. And I don't, but I also try to balance it and understand that what you don't want to come off as that this is all about me, because it's not. It's about the research. But there's, you know, but I have to kind of, you balance those out. But there's these different ways that we do it. So there's the situating in the field, the kind of talking about, this is how I got here, this was my experience. There's also the placing the sort of actually direct address to the reader. And that's it's something that's interesting when that's done. I don't know how much you did that in your own book. That's one of the ways that kind of pushes, I think, the boundary for a lot of research writing when you're like, I specifically identify the audience as being kind of implicated in what you're doing. And with getting that review, though, I have to say that even though it was disturbing, the book is much better for it, because I thought very strategically about where I was using the eye, and where I needed it, and because the more you use it, the less punch it has. So if you really want to say, I want you to stand here in my shoes and see through my eyes, then you use it. But there are other times when you don't need to, and it's okay. But it's harder when you lose the first person. It's often easy to go into passive voice, which makes things less interesting.
And I just want to add to that, for quantitative sociologists, if you read a quantitative work or statistical analysis, you'll never read about the author. You'll never necessarily know who that person is, you know, where they grew up, how they approached the research, why it was important to them. That's not typical in that kind of writing style. And ethnographers will say to quantitative sociologists, you should write a little more about your own perspective, because it is shaping the question you're asking and the way you're framing the problem. But sometimes quantitative sociologists will look at ethnographers kind of self-indulgence and say, I think this work is becoming more of a memoir of your own research rather than, you know, a story about what's going on in the field.
Great. Any other questions? Yes?
Mr. Bonnie, in archaeology, do you have like a method of interpreting your field notes? Like, I know how much about coding, so how do you go through and determine what you use and what's useful?
Well, you know, partly it goes back to that we have these different types of forms. So I often, when I come back, I almost have to I have to kind of write the story of every excavation unit. I have to reconstruct what happened at the site based on that. And so I go back to to those forms first. And then as I'm reading through them, then I will open up the field journals of the people who's writing them. And so what I often do is I end up writing a sort of, essentially almost an excavation narrative. So I'm taking all of these diverse stories and I'm pulling them into one. But the other thing that I'm doing is the spatial analysis too, and sometimes that is statistical. So I will do something where I will look at what types of items are coming from different layers of that layer cake of archaeology, and that's helping me understand how they're connecting to each other. So it's a method of triangulation. But certainly the kind of coding of themes, because I'm also use historic documents as well. So I do a very similar thing to look at what are the kinds of themes that are coming out repeatedly in the research that I'm doing, and how does that connect to what I'm seeing on the ground.
How about you said the activists in Oakland wanted you to share their research with them? I was just wondering how you shared it, like if you shared your book or if there were other forms of your research that you shared, and then what they thought of it.
Yeah, you know, I actually shared the finished product, and that raises another issue. That was kind of like a shock for me, is that I gave them this 350-page dissertation, and I was, you know, and then I was surprised when I didn't hear anything back. But these are busy activists who probably don't have time to read a 350-page, you know, academic treatise. So I actually didn't get much of feedback from them until I presented at conferences in Oakland and invited them. And that was a really scary moment too, because as academics, we're usually never trained to present to the people we research. And I had no kind of map for that, no guide. And I was much more nervous about what they would think of the way I was telling their lives than what other academic reviewers were thinking of my work. But they liked it, and they felt like I actually portrayed them more heroically than they saw themselves. So I think I erred on the side of being more of a heroic portrait.
Yes?
In each of your fields, is there a certain research method that's like the most popular or most used?
Interesting. I mean, in my field, it's so incredibly interdisciplinary that I suppose that if you would say that at the baseline that the concept of field work, that you need to go out and actually document painstakingly that very tangible evidence of what people have done. That although there are ways to do archaeology with existing collections, there are ways to have it really be based more on kind of ethnographic work about what people are doing now. I think we really valorize the field as a sort of set of techniques. And it's also really kind of what defines us as archaeologists. And so that's one of the reasons why I've been very interested in looking at the role of writing in archaeology, because I think we don't think about ourselves as authors and writers as much as we think about ourselves as, diggers and surveyors. And but for every hour I spend in the field, I spend 3 in the lab or at my computer. So I do more of that, in terms of just actual hours than I do, being in the field.
I think that's a great question in sociology, and I think there's maybe an identity crisis of some sociologists insisting that we are real scientists and others saying that sociology is more of an art. And I think there's a big conflict there and an enduring conversation about it. But, ethnography can solve questions and answer things that quantitative can't, and vice versa. So it's kind of a tough thing, I think. But I will say, and maybe you can add to this if you want, that sometimes ethnographers will gripe a little bit about where to send their work. And they might want to shoot for the top journals, but they realize that the top journals are really biased towards quantitative work, that those really want to portray sociology as a hard science. And ethnographers kind of give up on some of those journals because of that. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I would agree, and just say that I think sort of quantitative methodologies have historically probably been more dominant, but that ethnographic and qualitative work are kind of making strides to get their share of the field.
And just as a sort of nudge toward tomorrow evening, if you're interested in hearing more about intersections of qualitative and quantitative research, we have a number of other scholars who are going to be coming tomorrow evening at 6:30 in 251, which is sort of behind us here, where we'll have our second panel about research and writing. Not to shoo anyone away, did we have any other questions? Do we have one right back here?
So in your interviews with the kids, they range in time from about 45 minutes to 3 hours. Do you find that some of them were more open to answering your questions? And how did you sort of help the more closed interviewees become more comfortable in giving the information?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, what I found is that in Oakland, my ethnographic portion, my participant observation was much richer because I was the only white person, but I wasn't the only adult there. So adults kind of facilitated my access to the group. There were adult allies. But when I started to interview those kids, when they had been comfortable with me in group settings, all of a sudden I noticed they became kind of rigid and they were kind of just giving terse answers to my questions, and it almost seemed like a threatening kind of exchange. And I realized after talking with some of the kids that they had had so many interactions with social workers, and me as a sociologist was very non-distinguishable from a social worker. And so that kind of environment felt practiced to them, and kind of an environment that they weren't trusting me kind of to open up. So that was really challenging. And so I had to keep saying, there's no right or wrong answer here, this is totally confidential, and you don't have to answer questions that make you uncomfortable, and I'm just wondering more about this. But I had a real challenge there. And Portland was completely the opposite. Those were youth only. They didn't have any adult allies, so I was the only adult there. And so because of that, the participant observation was a little more limited. But once I got them to talk with me one-on-one, they just couldn't stop. You know, they wanted to talk about all their frustrations with the group. They wanted to give me all their ideas on politics because nobody asked them. And they felt invisible socially, whereas kids in Oakland felt hyper-visible, like I was going to kind of look at them through the microscope and punish them for what they were revealing. So that was a challenge, and it took me a while to figure out why my interviews in Portland were so much richer than Oakland. Yeah, but I think all you can do is try to kind of make them feel comfortable, and I had to kind of do with what I had in Oakland.
How did you, just thinking about language, how did you define teenager? Just because I'm wondering, like, was it an age thing? Because I noticed you use kids,
Yeah.
adults.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and that's actually what I noticed, what I was shocked by in my research, that each group identified youth totally differently and defined it, and also defined ageism totally differently. So in Oakland, because they were adult allies, they saw some of those adult allies as also youth, because they were like young college students. Whereas in Portland, youth was high school. That was teenager. Like once you're 18, you can't be a youth anymore. And once you're 18, you can't come back to the group. So it created this tension in the group where they had to kind of do all kinds of direct actions, but they could never have long drawn-out discussions or struggles with each other because they didn't have time. You know, they were going to age out. So I had to kind of, that was part of my research, was understanding how they viewed youth.
My students, like most of our students, are doing field work in like 5 weeks or 7 weeks instead of 5 or 7 years. That's really tough. And so I keep telling my students, okay, just go to the restaurant and start writing. Don't have a hypothesis, don't even have a thesis statement, but let's be practical. At some point, we can't even get to the issue of how to write up the results or code these. Can you offer them some advice how to do a quick field project and still produce something from it? That's tough.
Well, I would suggest that again, thinking about the ways that you can triangulate your data, and this is me as someone who looks a lot at the physical of spaces, is that it's that in your notes, like if you are already doing it, draw sketch maps. You know, look at the space, and that's another way. You know, maybe one day you pay attention to how many people come and go out the door, how long they stay. Look at movement. You know, so think about the sort of that places are these kind of that your observations, you can almost think about it as this dance and how that is affecting it. So so that when so it's almost like changing that focus in different ways, and you'll see different things. You know, someday close your eyes and just listen. You know, think about the soundscape of that, or the smell. What does it smell like? Again, there's the sensory experience that we're a very visually oriented culture, but that the senses really are very important ways for you to do that. So it's almost like you could kind of focus it on these different things, and then they almost help, like, even though they kind of can triangulate again, even if you're not going to go and gather, you know, statistical data, for example, about it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to just be good observers, be thoughtful, and think about, because sometimes you're not going to feel comfortable there. You're right. You have to come and do your notes afterwards, but after a while, I think that you know, 5 weeks is enough time to see some patterns. I'd say, you know, 2 weeks is enough to see some patterns.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's true, and I run into the same issue. I teach ethnography to my students, and we read these brilliant ethnographies, and we talk about why they're so brilliant, and then students do about 8 weeks of their own ethnography and say, wait a minute, there's no way that this can be anything like that work. And that's true, and some people say that good ethnography should be, you know, 12 to 14 hours a day in the field, which is a lot, and that brings up a question of who can even do this, you know? But I would agree with Bonnie that if you're looking systematically to take notes on what's going on, you're viewing the site in a way that you won't in everyday life. And it is enough time to see patterns emerge. And you'll never know if those are going to wash out later. If you were going to do that for a year, would you see the same patterns, or would you revise? but you might find that you would kind of support your original findings.
Well, particularly I think on the quarter system, you know, very often my students do original research, and I think that oftentimes what ends up happening is you don't get any answers, you just get more interesting and more informed questions. And I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, but you know, I'm usually
I'm
okay.
on the process. I'm not
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love more questions.
I was wondering what kind of role either photography or filming the site or illustrating the site has in addition to like words and notes, you know, in relationship between those.
That's really, particularly for my field, that's very important. So as you saw, it's one of the reasons why I had a PowerPoint. To me, I can't capture that without photography. So photography is always important, and I always document things with photographs and then, of course, with sketches as well, because your eye is different when you're really, it's almost more that you see something different when you have to draw it than you would if you just say, oh, I'm going to take a picture and look at it later. As sometimes we do a videography, you know, so we're actually, we'll film what's going on. And I don't know if you did any stuff with video as well, but oftentimes ethnographic film is its whole other genre of taking pictures. So those are important supplements to, I think, the written word. And you know, one of the things that's always the kind of make or break on an archaeological book is how many illustrations are they going to give you. So, you know, if they're only going to give you 10 illustrations, you go to a different publisher, because you need that. It's just so hard to explain, for example, the pattern of masonry in a wall if you can't put a picture in.
Do the photographs or films also figure into the process of interpreting the data?
Yeah, so I'll go back and look at the pictures again. Like I'll look at, again, that thinking of triangulation. I'll look at the field form and I think, wait a minute, and I'll go back and I'll look at the photographs as well. And I'm just paranoid enough that, because you can only dig a site once, is that I actually do, in addition to my digital color photography, I do black and white real film, archival, so that it, just like my field notes will be in a file drawer forever, so will those photographs.
For me, that would have been risky, and as much as I would have loved to capture some of the protest scenes and some of those moments, these kids were underage, some of them breaking the law, doing civil disobedience, and if I were to whip out a camera, that would be it. Because the groups actually, one of the groups in Portland suspected I was a cop for a long time. And so I had to carry that stigma with me through the whole research, and that would have just cemented that. But there is a whole area of visual sociology, and some ethnographers will argue that it's better to take pictures because it humanizes the story even more.
How long did it take to get IRB approval, Pablo? Because we talk about IRB, and my students and I quickly realize we can't do the cool research we wish we could do.
Yeah.
And you're doing cool stuff. I mean, who wouldn't want to go take field notes there?
There were a lot of red flags because this was considered a vulnerable population, youth. But would have been more of a hurdle is if I were working with their schools. And so if I were to have to gain permission from the schools to study youth as well as my own IRB, that would have made it even longer. Yeah. But I wasn't studying the schools, I was studying these youth groups. And actually, part of the problem was that IRB asked me for official permission from the youth groups on letterhead to say that that I was invited to participate with them. And I was like, letterhead? Like, especially these kids in Portland, this is not even a funded organization. They don't even have a space to meet.
They're anarchists.
What anarchists have letterhead? So I kind of tried to explain this. I actually I talked to IRB about my questions, my struggles. And they said, well, as long as they're meeting in a public place, then you can have access and it won't be such a hurdle. And they were meeting in a public place, but only because they didn't have a private place to meet. So and I realized that later, that they weren't meeting in a public place because the public was invited, just because they didn't have another space to go to. But the IRB, you know, according to the IRB, if it's public, it's public. So it didn't take me too long, but in the end, I don't think the IRB necessarily protected them in the ways that IRB should.
Okay, well, I think that about wraps us for time. I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to thank Bonnie and Hava again for sharing their work with us. And I can assure you that most of us are actually going toward our qualitative research in the next couple of weeks, and this is all going to mean a lot more then. So remember what you heard tonight and apply it to your projects.